Something just cracked in Brussels and the sound is going to travel. For the first time in the history of the European Union, all 27 member states have agreed to sanction Israeli citizens, not Hamas operatives, not Iranian proxies, not some shadowy militant cell hiding in the hills of southern Lebanon. Israeli civilians, settlers, names, faces, organizations with offices, donors, and board members, and it happened on a Monday morning, May 11th, 2026. While most of America was still asleep, while the cable networks were still running their weekend filler, the foreign ministers of every single EU country sat down in a room and did something Washington has refused to do, refused to even consider for nearly 6 decades. They drew a line. And on the wrong side of that line, for the first time ever, sits a category of people the United States has spent 50 years calling friends, partners, allies, and in some quarters, the moral frontier of Western civilization itself. Let that sink in for a second. Because what just happened in Brussels is not a press release, it is not symbolic, it is not a strongly worded letter. The EU does not blink when it does this. Sanctions are not theater. Sanctions freeze assets, they block bank accounts, they lock people out of the global financial system, they turn a name on a list into a person who cannot board a plane, cannot wire money to a son in London, cannot buy a house in Cyprus, cannot move a euro through any institution that touches the European clearing system. And right now in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in the hilltop outposts of the West Bank, phones are ringing that have never rung before because the wall held for months. Hungary held it. Viktor Orban held it. And then Hungary changed and the wall fell. And what fell with it is the last European illusion that this conflict could go on year after year, decade after decade, without anyone in the West actually doing anything about the violence happening in those hills. There is a before this Monday, and there is an after. We are in the after now. And if you think Washington is not feeling this, if you think the White House didn't get a phone call about this, if you think the Israeli government is treating this as some minor European huff, you have not been paying attention to how these things start. This is how they start, quietly, with 7 names on a list. And a chairwoman in Brussels saying into a microphone that extremism has consequences. Stay with me, because what comes next is bigger than 7 names. Here is what actually happened. On Monday, May 11th, the foreign ministers of all 27 EU member states met in Brussels and unanimously approved the bloc's first ever sanctions package targeting Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. The measures hit 7 individuals and a group of settler organizations. Reporting from the BBC and the forward names, senior settler movement figure Daniela Weiss among the sanctioned individuals, along with the organizations Nachala, Regavim, Hashomer Yosh, and Amana. If you do not know those names, you are not supposed to. They have operated for decades in the gray spaces of the West Bank, building, expanding, organizing, fundraising, sometimes in coordination with the Israeli state, sometimes against its stated policy, almost always with quiet protection from the political right in Jerusalem. Daniela Weiss is not a fringe figure. She is one of the architects of the modern settler movement, a woman who has spent a lifetime arguing that every hilltop, every olive grove, every Palestinian village in the West Bank is part of a biblical inheritance that no European, no American, no diplomat in a blue suit has any authority to question. Now her name sits on an EU sanctions list, right next to the names of Russian oligarchs, right next to figures from the Wagner Group, right next to officials from Iran and Syria and Belarus. That is the symbolic weight of this. And the symbolism in this case is the policy. The announcement came from Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief, the former Prime Minister of Estonia, a woman who built her career hammering Vladimir Putin and refusing to look away from Russian aggression. She stood at the lectern in Brussels and said in plain language that it was time to move from stalemate to action. Extremism and violence, she said, have consequences. Read that line again. Extremism and violence have consequences. Said by the EU's top diplomat about Israeli citizens. That sentence would have been unthinkable in Brussels 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 6 months ago, because for months the proposal sat in a drawer, frozen, vetoed, blocked by one country and one man, Hungary, Viktor Orban. Orban had spent the better part of a decade rebranding himself as Israel's closest friend in Europe. He had welcomed Benjamin Netanyahu to Budapest with full honors when an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court hung over the Israeli Prime Minister's head. He had stood alone among EU leaders as the unbreakable veto on anything Brussels tried to do about Gaza, about settlements, about settler violence, about the West Bank, and then he lost power. The new government in Budapest is not a left-wing dream. It is not pro-Palestinian. It is not anti-Israeli. It is something more boring and more dangerous for the old order. It is a government that has decided not to spend its political capital protecting a settler movement on the other side of the Mediterranean. So the veto came off, the package moved, the vote happened, 7 names, 4 organizations, 27 countries, unanimous. And the entire European posture toward Israel just changed. To understand how big this is, you have to understand how long this took. The first serious push inside the EU to sanction settlers did not start last month. It started years ago. Back in 2023, before October 7th, before the Gaza war, when the headlines about settler attacks on Palestinian villages were already piling up at a rate that made European diplomats deeply uncomfortable. Olive farmers beaten in their fields, houses burned, cars torched, whole villages emptied at gunpoint while soldiers stood and watched, or in some documented cases, joined in. European foreign ministries were getting cables. Aid workers were filing reports. UN agencies were publishing data showing settler attacks at the highest rate ever recorded. And the question in Brussels became impossible to dodge. Was Europe going to keep treating this as a tragic but unavoidable side effect of an unresolved conflict? Or was Europe going to start naming names? For a long time, the answer was nothing. Statements. Concerns, the diplomatic equivalent of a frown. Then the US moved first. Yes, the Biden administration, before the political wind shifted, imposed limited sanctions on a small number of settlers. Britain followed. France pushed. Germany, ever cautious about anything that could be framed as anti-Israeli, dragged its feet but signaled it would not block a European move. And then October 7th happened. And the war in Gaza happened. And the West Bank, in the shadow of that war, became something far darker than it had been before. In the months after October 7th, settler violence did not pause out of solidarity. It accelerated. Palestinian villages that had been tense for years were suddenly under sustained assault. Whole communities were displaced. Human rights organizations, including Israeli ones, documented hundreds of incidents. The Israeli military, stretched thin and politically aligned with the settler right under the Netanyahu coalition, did not stop it. In many cases, the Israeli government's most senior security officials warned in their own internal language that things were getting out of hand. Inside the EU, the pressure built. Spain went public, Ireland went public, Belgium pushed hard, the Nordics signed on, France pushed the file forward. By the end of 2024, a package was ready. By early 2025, it was on the table. And every time Hungary said no, Orban's veto was not subtle. He used it as leverage in other negotiations. He used it as a card to play with Netanyahu, who repaid him with diplomatic favors and friendly statements. Inside Brussels meetings, EU officials privately admitted that the settler sanctions file had become a symbol of European paralysis. One country, 12 million people, holding the foreign policy of a continent of 400 million hostage on the single most explosive issue in global politics. The frustration was open. Callas, almost immediately after taking over the foreign policy portfolio, made the file a priority. She told European outlets she would not let it sit. She traveled, she lobbied, she pressured, and still, Hungary held, until Hungary did not. When the political shift happened in Budapest, the calculus changed overnight. The new foreign minister signaled in private meetings that the veto would lift. The package was dusted off. The lists were finalized, the legal language was tightened, and the meeting was scheduled for May 11th. By the time the ministers walked into the room on Monday morning, the outcome was already known. But knowing it was coming did not make it any less of an earthquake when it actually landed. The room in Brussels on Monday morning was not theatrical. It rarely is. EU foreign affairs councils are quiet rooms, diplomats in dark suits, translators in glass booths, the clinking of water glasses, the shuffling of paper. That is what makes what happened there so much heavier than a speech in a parliament. The vote was procedural. The list was already agreed. The legal framework had already been drafted under the EU's existing human rights sanctions regime, the same framework used to sanction abusers in Russia, in Iran, in Belarus, in Myanmar, in Syria. There was no debate to be had at the table. The political work had been done in the weeks before. Callas walked in. The ministers nodded. The decision was adopted. And then she walked out and spoke to the cameras. She said it was time to move from stalemate to action. She said extremism and violence have consequences. She did not name Israel as a state. She did not have to. She named individuals. She named organizations. She named a movement. Daniela Weiss, Nachala, Regavim, Hashomer Yosh, Amana. Those words, spoken in Brussels into a microphone on the record, marked the moment Europe stopped pretending. For decades, Europe's official position on settlements has been simple to write and impossible to act on. Settlements are illegal under international law. The EU has said so in every official document since before some of us were born. Goods produced in settlements are labeled differently in European markets. EU funding does not flow to settler organizations. The diplomatic position has been clear, but the gap between saying something is illegal and doing something about it is the gap that ate European credibility on this issue for a generation. Monday closed that gap. Once you sanction individuals, you have crossed a threshold. Sanctions do not just freeze assets, they mark the sanctioned person. They make them politically toxic. They send a signal to every bank, every law firm, every shipping company, every real estate broker, every charity, every donor in the West, that doing business with these people now carries risk. European banks will run compliance checks. American banks will run compliance checks because they have to clear euros through European correspondent banks. Swiss banks will quietly start closing accounts. Insurance companies will not insure the cargo. Auditors will not sign off on the books. The financial walls do not need to be built. They build themselves the moment the name hits the list. And then there is the political dimension. Inside Israel, the sanctioned individuals are not marginal. They have backers in the Knesset. They have allies inside the cabinet. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, has spent his career championing exactly the kind of organizations that just got named. Itamar Ben-Gvir has called settlers heroes. Netanyahu has built his coalition on their support. So when the EU sanctions 7 settlers, the EU is, in effect, putting a financial and moral stigma on the political base of the sitting Israeli government. That is the turning point. That is the moment the camera holds on. That is the click of a lock being thrown. You do not undo this. You do not walk it back. You do not negotiate this list down once it has been adopted by 27 countries. Removing a single name from an EU sanctions list requires unanimity. Unanimity that took years to achieve in the first place. The list is going to grow, not shrink. The reaction came fast. Israel's foreign ministry responded within hours. The language was furious. The statement called the sanctions a moral failure, a strategic mistake, a sign that the EU was rewarding terrorism by punishing Israelis. The Israeli ambassador to Brussels was instructed to deliver a formal protest. Netanyahu's office released a longer statement. The prime minister called the move shameful. He said Europe was abandoning the Jewish state in its hour of need. He invoked October 7th. He invoked the hostages. He invoked the long memory of European anti-Semitism, which is the heaviest card any Israeli leader can play in Brussels, and he played it with full force. Smotrich went further. The finance minister, himself a settler, himself the political patron of organizations like Amana, called the EU's action illegitimate and said he would explore countermeasures targeting European trade with Israel. Ben-Gvir, in his usual style, posted on social media. He called Callas a name that does not need to be repeated here. He praised the sanctioned settlers as patriots. He said Europe should mind its own business. Inside the West Bank, in the hilltop outposts and the larger settlements, the reaction was a mix of defiance and anger. Daniela Weiss, the most prominent of the sanctioned figures, gave an interview to Israeli television in which she said she wore the sanctions as a badge of honor. She said she would not stop. She said the land was hers and the EU could keep its bank accounts. That is the public posture. In private, lawyers are scrambling. Accountants are reviewing client lists. Settlement charities that have for decades raised money in the United States through tax-exempt structures are now in a much harder position because the moment a U.S. donor sends money to a sanctioned EU entity, they expose themselves to enforcement risk that did not exist last week. The American reaction was the most carefully watched of all. The Trump administration's State Department issued a short statement expressing concern that the EU had moved without consultation. Officials privately briefed reporters that Washington considered the sanctions counterproductive. The president himself, on his social media platform, called the EU weak and said Europe should be helping Israel, not hurting it. But the substance of the American response was thinner than the language. There were no countermeasures. There was no threat of retaliation against EU member states. There was notably no announcement of U.S. sanctions on EU officials, which some Republican voices in Washington had been demanding for months. That silence is its own signal. The White House is not going to war with Brussels over this, not yet. The markets noticed. The shekel weakened against the euro and the dollar. Israeli sovereign debt spreads ticked wider. Tel Aviv stocks dipped on the open and recovered partially during the session. Energy markets were mostly quiet because the news did not threaten supply, but the underlying tension in the region added a small premium to oil. Insurers covering Israeli infrastructure quietly began reviewing exposure. European reaction inside the bloc was a study in carefully calibrated relief. Spain's foreign minister called the decision overdue. Ireland's Toiseach welcomed it. France's foreign ministry issued a tight, formal statement praising EU unity. Germany was more cautious, emphasizing that Berlin remained committed to Israel's security while supporting the targeted measures against specific individuals. Britain, no longer in the EU but moving in parallel, signaled that London would consider matching the new EU designations under its own human rights sanctions regime. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand each opened internal reviews. And in the global south, in capitals from Pretoria to Brasilia to Jakarta, the message landed differently. For governments that have spent years arguing that the West applies international law selectively, depending on whether the violator is friend or foe, Monday was a small but real shift. Europe had finally sanctioned Israelis for human rights of all things. The double standard had not vanished, but it had cracked. So who wins this and who loses? The losers are easy to name first. The Israeli settler movement loses immediately and severely in ways that go beyond 7 frozen bank accounts. The movement has long depended on a quiet but enormously consequential international architecture. Donations flowing in from American and European supporters, real estate holdings across the West Bank financed through diaspora networks, lobbying budgets, travel for organizers, conferences in European capitals to recruit young settlers from abroad. All of that just got harder. Not impossible, but harder. And in the world of activist movements, friction is fatal. Netanyahu loses, not because his coalition collapses tomorrow, but because the international cover for his far-right partners has been pierced. He has spent 2.5 years arguing to the Israeli public that he can manage Israel's relationships with the West while keeping the settler right inside his government. The EU just told him those two things may not be compatible. Every time he stands at a podium in Jerusalem and praises Daniela Weiss, he is now praising someone the European Union has officially classified as a violator of human rights. That is a political cost. It will be paid eventually. Orban loses too, even though he is no longer in office. His brand inside Europe was built partly on being the immovable veto, the one strong man who could not be pushed. The new Hungarian government just demonstrated that the veto was not an iron law. It was a political choice, and political choices can be reversed. The winners are more interesting. Kaja Kallas wins. She came into the foreign policy job underestimated. Critics said she was too focused on Russia. They said she would not be able to manage the bloc's many competing priorities. She just delivered the most consequential EU foreign policy decision on the Middle East in a decade. Her credibility inside European capitals just went up. The European Commission wins. The bloc spent the last 2 years staggering between crises: the war in Ukraine, the collapse of the German economic model, the trade war with the United States under the Trump administration, the Brexit aftermath that keeps not aftermathing. Monday gave the EU something it has not had in a long time: a clean, unanimous, principled foreign policy decision that demonstrates it can actually move when it decides to. Palestinian civil society wins in a small and bitter way. The communities in the South Hebron Hills, in the Jordan Valley, in the villages around Nablus that have absorbed the brunt of settler violence for years now have an instrument that did not exist before. Western law firms working pro bono for Palestinian villagers now have a foothold. Future incidents can be documented and added to expansion lists. The sanctions framework, once open, is much easier to expand than to create. And then there is the longer game. The most interesting winner of Monday's decision is the principle that international law on settlements is no longer purely rhetorical inside the West's own toolkit. For a generation, the legal status of the settlements has been a wedge between what governments say and what they do. Monday narrowed that wedge. It did not close it, but it narrowed it. What changes long term? Three things. First, the price of being a high-profile settler organization just went up. The cost of doing business in the West Bank for the most ideological wing of the movement is now higher than it has ever been. Some organizations will adapt, others will fade. The marginal donor in Brooklyn or Paris or Manchester will think twice. Second, the political insulation of the Israeli far right inside Western diplomacy just thinned. Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, the entire ecosystem of cabinet ministers who have built their power on the settler base, now look from a European perspective like patrons of sanctioned individuals. That changes the meeting list. That changes the photo op list. That changes the future. Third, and this is the one Washington is reading most carefully, the transatlantic gap on Israel just widened. Not catastrophically, not irreparably, but measurably. The EU did what the Trump administration would never do, and the Trump administration could not stop it. That tells every other capital in the world something about where power flows now. Step back. Look at the whole board. What just happened in Brussels is not really about 7 settlers. It is about the slow recomposition of the post-1945 Western Alliance. For most of the modern era, the United States and Europe operated as a single bloc on the big questions of foreign policy. Different accents, different tactics, but the same general framework. Israel was inside that framework, untouchable, defended, funded, armed, diplomatically protected at the UN, insulated from consequence. The Trump administration's second term has pulled that framework apart. Tariffs on European allies, threats against NATO, public hostility toward Brussels institutions. The remaking of U.S. Middle East policy around a tight Trump-Netanyahu axis, with the Gulf monarchies on one side and the rest of the world on the other. Europe has spent 2 years figuring out what to do inside that new reality. The default answer for most of those 2 years has been to wait, to absorb, to hope the storm passes. Monday is the first sign that Europe has stopped waiting. The sanctions on settlers are a test case. They are a way for the EU to discover in low-risk increments whether it can act on the international stage without Washington, sometimes against Washington's preferences, and survive. The answer so far is yes. The dollar did not collapse. The transatlantic alliance did not formally break. The phones in Brussels are still ringing. The trade still flows. And yet a policy that the White House did not want was passed anyway. That is a small but real declaration of European foreign policy autonomy. For Israel, the implications are heavier. The country has built its entire strategic doctrine on the assumption that the West moves as a bloc, and that as long as Washington holds, the rest of the West will follow. Monday punctures that assumption. Europe is now demonstrating that it is willing to take measures the White House opposes. The next steps, if escalation continues, are sharper. Trade preferences, association agreements, visa policies, the full toolkit of European economic statecraft. For democracy and institutions inside Israel itself, the message is uncomfortable but clarifying. The democratic checks that should have constrained settler violence from inside the Israeli system, the courts, the attorney general, the military command, have not held. International institutions are now stepping into spaces that domestic ones have failed to fill. That is not a comfortable story for any country. It is the same story we have told about Russia, about Iran, about Myanmar. The fact that Israel is now beginning to appear in the same sentence as those examples is itself a measure of how far the situation has drifted. For markets, the warning is subtle but real. Sanctions create compliance overhead. Compliance overhead creates friction. Friction priced into capital costs. Israeli risk premiums will tick up. Israeli sovereign borrowing will get marginally more expensive. Foreign direct investment into sensitive sectors will slow. None of this is catastrophic by itself. all of it compounds. And for the global order, the takeaway is the simplest. Western consensus on the Middle East is no longer guaranteed. The era in which Israel could count on the unanimous diplomatic shield of the democratic world is over. Whatever replaces it will be messier, more contested, and more dependent on the day-to-day political weather in capitals from Washington to Berlin to Madrid to Warsaw. The old order leaked for years. Monday was the moment it visibly cracked. So here is where we are. It is a Wednesday in May. The sanctions are in force. The lists are public. The Israeli government is angry. The American president is angry. The settler leaders are defiant on camera and quiet with their accountants. The Palestinian villages in the West Bank look the same as they did last week because 7 names on a list in Brussels do not stop a bulldozer in the Jordan Valley. And yet something has moved. A wall held for months in Europe, and then it fell. A category of person that had been politically untouchable in Western capitals for the better part of 50 years is now formally sanctioned. A foreign policy chief in Brussels said out loud what diplomats have been whispering for a generation, that extremism and violence have consequences. And then she signed her name to it. Whether this is the beginning of a new European posture or a one-off moment that fades into the next news cycle depends on what happens in the next 90 days. Watch the second list when it comes. Watch which names get added. Watch whether London and Ottawa and Canberra match the designations. Watch what Washington does, not what it says. Watch the next vote inside the Israeli coalition on West Bank annexation, and watch whether Smotrich pushes harder or pulls back. Watch the donor networks in New York and Miami and the consequence chain they suddenly find themselves inside. But do not look away from this. Because the stories that change a generation almost never look like wars or summits. They look like a quiet meeting in Brussels on a Monday morning, 27 hands going up at the same time, and a list of 7 names that does not feel like much until you realize it can never be unwritten. The hill country in the West Bank is going to be tense tonight. The phones in Jerusalem are going to keep ringing. The lawyers in Tel Aviv are billing through the weekend. The donors in Manhattan are calling their accountants. And in Brussels somewhere, Kaja Kallas is already working on the next file. The story is not over. It is just out from behind the curtain. Stay with this. Follow what happens next. Because the people who decide the future of this conflict are not anymore only sitting in Washington and Jerusalem. They are sitting in Brussels too. And that is new. That is the part to remember.